How many times have you heard a series be called the best or the greatest, the GOAT, whether it's said unseriously or sarcastically or genuinely? It's too many to count, and everyone has their own thoughts on the topic, so most likely you're not going to agree with another person's take, since such a discussion could very quickly turn south if you just so happen to be talking to someone who, say, views their own opinion as fact, which on the internet is also very likely. And then the lines get even more blurred when taking into account people's biases, their own opinion. Everyone has a favorite, a story that they love more than any other, and one that means more to them than any other, and then the whole conversation gets thrown for a loop. So those stories that you think belong in those upper echelon conversations, keep them in mind, because while I'm not going to give a definitive answer, I'm going to try and differentiate what it means for a story to be your favorite, the best, or the greatest. And I also should say, ironically, this is my own viewpoint, my own perspective on this topic, so bear that in mind also. The first part is to define each of them, and the easiest one out of the three to define is favorite, which I already began to do in the intro a bit. But simply put, if someone uses the term favorite or any adjacent terms like personally, in my opinion, then there should be absolutely zero need for any kind of deliberation or argument, so long as that person is clearly stating that what they are saying is completely subjective to them and them alone, as long as they aren't being sarcastic or condescending about it, of course. The word favorite is a pretty clear indicator that these are that specific person's thoughts, and obviously everyone's favorite is going to be different one way or another, because this will be purely biased. This opinion will be shaped around that certain individual's likes and dislikes. They'll have their own justifications of why they think this way, and maybe subconsciously that story or whatever may connect to something about them that they don't even realize. And what I mean by that is, I'm not going to make this too philosophical or too deep, but everyone's lived their own life completely unique and different, that shaped them into what they are today, which includes forming their preferences and their indifferences. That's obvious enough, but to take it a step further, some people have gone through such hardships or difficulties in that life that a particular story may speak to them in an entirely different way than it would to someone else. And you may have seen people discuss how there was a certain story, such a story that had saved them or helped them through a rough patch in their life. So again, that's something completely contained to their own personal perspective, no one else's. So with something being called someone's favorite, there shouldn't be a debate to be had, because the only person who can decide what your favorite is you. And one thing I will mention here, which I will go into more detail about later, is that although I am saying that these three concepts, I guess, are separate, there is still some overlap across them, which I'll get to after I talk about each of them individually. So on to the next one, which is the best, which I found to be the hardest to fully define. This term should be used in the context of an objective, critical point of view, where what someone prefers has no bearing or relevance here. Your personal feelings do not matter. Your bias carries as much weight here as an ant, meaning it carries no weight here at all. To be called the best is like the highest level of praise for something, so when determining whether something is worthy of that praise, that accolade, then it should be done fairly, impartially, so that there can be no leeway and no arguments to be had again, because there is only one that can be bestowed the title of the best, to be the best, and yet there's countless stories, like I said before, out there that are called that, which is because with storytelling specifically, there's so many different metrics that go into creating a good story, and each of those metrics can be critiqued individually, and that could show that certain stories are very good at some things and maybe not so good at other things. So then, how do you determine which parts of a story carry more weight than other parts, and say that there is a low point in an amazing story, a big drop off, and then there's another story that is consistently good throughout but never anything special? How do you determine what takes precedence here? And another thing, something that is completely out of the story's control, is genres. There's so many different genres where stories are trying to do different things. Maybe compare Game of Thrones to SpongeBob SquarePants. They are trying to achieve completely different things, so should they be measured by different metrics? I mean, SpongeBob is a simple story that probably contradicts itself in every single episode, but if you take the point of view that any story's goal is to entertain its target audience, then SpongeBob at its best was doing that easily. So then do you measure it by that metric rather than its actual story? I said this is the hardest one for me to define because there's so many intricacies that go into it, but in summary it's exactly what I said at the start. The discussion should be without preference or bias so that there can be fair judgment. And finally, I said that being called the best is like the highest praise available, but maybe being called the greatest holds even bigger significance. And with the two terms, the best and the greatest, defining them maybe does depend on what you're talking about. What I mean is, in sports, the best or greatest player is one in the same, because the stats are there for everyone to see. Obviously, there's still some deliberation there as well, but it's more clear. But with storytelling and here anime and manga, it's not so clear cut. So I gave my 2 cents on the best, and as for the greatest, I'd say it's a bit of a mix between what I talked about for your favorite and what I talked about for the best, and a bit more in between. What I mean is that in the context of anime and manga, the greatest would be defined as the one story that is incredibly well known, is incredibly popular, has a huge fan base, and is incredibly influential. So influence obviously isn't something based on opinion, but it's also not based on pure quality of the story. To be the greatest, it needs to have an insane impact that helped to shape its industry even far after its run had ended, and with this definition it favors older series more, those that have been around for a couple decades at least, since a story being truly influential can only really be seen after its time, where you can see its likeness in newer stories that took inspiration from it. You can't really call a newer series influential no matter how good it is, because not enough time has passed yet to see it bear those fruits. And another thing to differentiate the greatest from the best here is that, logically speaking, a newer story taking inspiration from an older one should, in theory, mean that the newer one is better, since it should be able to refine and build on those story beats, but it wouldn't have the same effect as the story it was taking those story beats from. So even if it may be objectively better, it's not greater, if that makes sense. It won't be as iconic. Iconic is probably the perfect word for how I am defining the greatest. It's the most iconic. So to sum up each of the 3 in a single sentence, your favorite should be based on opinion, the best should be based on fact, and the greatest should be based on influence and iconicism. But as I said, there is overlap across each of them, and the common thread is opinion. As much as you can try to completely negate bias and stuff like that, it's always going to be in your mind. Your preferences are always going to be lingering and affecting your thought process. Even if you do get rid of those biases for each story, you will still have your own opinion of which parts of the story are more important than another, like I mentioned before, which will differ from someone else's. And right at the start, I made that disclaimer that it is my own perspective. You might have a different interpretation of the meanings of each of these 3 concepts, which again kind of removes the objectivity, since it's prioritizing your point of view. And another thing, I was talking about how the influence of a series plays into things and how it favors the older series. I didn't mention, however, how the mainstream anime today showcase their influence in another way, which is with collabs, whether it's clothing collabs with shoe brands or gaming like Fortnite collabs, as a way to expose it to a wider, newer audience and broaden its horizons. And kind of following on from that, a newer audience of anime and manga fans in general may have only watched the bigger and more modern names in the industry like JJK, MHA and such, and might have no idea about the older series like Sailor Moon or Fist of the North Star, which brings into question whose viewpoints are actually relevant and valid in these kinds of discussions of the greatest and the best. How many series must you have watched or read for your opinion to be valid? Well, there you go. I'm talking about the best and the greatest, and I bring up opinion. And talking about older series, the audience now is so much bigger for these stories than it was way back then. So is it really fair to compare them when the landscape from back then was so different to the landscape of today? And here's an interesting point. How many incredibly written series do you think are out there that no one has ever heard of because they're published in some extremely obscure magazine instead of Shonen Jump with no anime adaptation? It's almost guaranteed that such stories exist. And lastly, this is something that we have all at least seen play out, which I mentioned right at the very beginning, but it's when people take their opinion for fact. Now the lines are completely blurred since they either unknowingly or purposefully mix and match these terms to express their thoughts, and it all spirals out of control from there when others jump into the discussion. And now all of a sudden, taking all of this into account, it seems nigh on impossible to truly define and differentiate specifically the best and the greatest. So to end it, now that I've made it crystal clear that opinion is always a factor here, or at least I hope I have, let me give my favourite, best and greatest series. Firstly, my favourite, which is obvious if you've seen the channel name and icon, it's One Piece. I love it more than any other fictional story out there, and to throw a little spice in there, although I don't have it as the greatest, I think it's definitely one of the greatest, and although I may not have it as the best, I also think it has a case for one of the best. Again, my opinion, I do not mean any harm by it. And not to get too into it or else we'll be here for the rest of the week, but remember when I said that people's lives will play a role in shaping their opinions? I'm a very family oriented person, what with my immediate family and then my cousins who I see all the time. They're more like extra siblings than cousins really, and my friends even who I'm in contact with every day, and you find these themes of friendship and family in absolutely every corner of One Piece. The best. I haven't actually ever thought too deeply about this, but I've thought regularly about this, if that makes sense. And whenever I do, there's always one specific series that comes to mind every single time, which is Berserk. The quality of the narrative, the richness of the themes, the detail of the art, the progression of the character development, I think that's a very good pick. And one thing before moving on, Berserk's obviously infamous for how dark it is, and I said how I think One Piece is one of the best, and back in the main discussion there was the topic of genres brought up, where stories are trying to do different things and trying to put across different messages. You can't compare Berserk and One Piece. I'm fully aware of how hard it is to get into Berserk because of the material that it covers, the sensitive topics and darkness of its story, and how vividly it portrays all of these things. I have a friend who says he can't call Berserk the best because of how dark it is. He has Vinland Saga as the best. So back to it, One Piece and Berserk are complete polar opposites. So one more time, guess what I'm going to say? It comes down to preference and opinion. And finally, the very last thing, the greatest. I assign the greatest to, and you really should have guessed it by now, Dragon Ball, the undisputed greatest, the most well-known, the most influential, the most impactful, the most iconic, so on and so forth. And that's probably never gonna change. Anyway, these were just my stupid ramblings that if you want to, you can completely disregard and move on with your life.